On October 15, 2023, Ranger Thomas Mitchell took the case 3 other rangers had refused after Dr. Sarah Chen had vanished after her final notes read, "They know I'm watching them." This Bigfoot investigation would be his last because what he discovered in those woods would challenge everything science believed about these creatures. The missing person case had started 3 days earlier when Dr. Sarah Chen failed to return from what should have been a routine research expedition in the Ho River Valley. Her university colleagues revealed she'd been tracking what she believed were Bigfoot family groups. When she missed her scheduled check-in, the university contacted the Park Service with growing concern about what she might have discovered. Sarah's base camp was found exactly where she'd indicated it would be, but her equipment told a story that didn't match any scenario the search teams could explain. Her research notes were scattered across the campsite, filled with detailed observations about Bigfoot social structures, communication patterns, and territorial behaviors. Fresh Bigfoot tracks surrounded her abandoned equipment, massive footprints that were less than hours old, suggesting the creatures had been examining her campsite recently. Thomas began his search at the camp as darkness settled over the forest, his headlamp cutting through shadows that seemed to move independently of any wind. The electromagnetic interference that had affected Sarah's equipment began impacting his gear as he followed her trail deeper into the forest. Most disturbing was the effect on his night vision equipment. The thermal imaging showed massive bipedal forms moving through the forest. But these weren't distant observations. A massive shadow detached itself from a cluster of trees ahead, revealing the unmistakable silhouette of a Bigfoot standing motionless in his path. The Bigfoot that blocked Thomas's route stood nearly 9 feet tall, its massive frame covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb his headlamp beam. The creature's posture was neither threatening nor submissive. It simply stood there, studying him with obvious intelligence while making no attempt to hide. Thomas realized this was no chance encounter. The Bigfoot had deliberately positioned itself to intercept him. The being's eyes reflected his light with unmistakable sentience, and when it tilted its head slightly, Thomas understood he was being evaluated by intelligence that possessed the cognitive ability to make complex decisions. The forest around Thomas began revealing signs of active Bigfoot presence that challenged his understanding of these creatures. Trees had been marked with scratches that were too high and systematic to be random, while the undergrowth showed evidence of pathways deliberately maintained by something with opposable thumbs. The territorial markers were positioned with obvious planning, creating a communication network that allowed these creatures to monitor vast areas while remaining hidden. Some of these markers were fresh. The Bigfoot were actively updating their system, possibly in response to his presence. The sounds that began following Thomas through the darkness were unmistakably the Bigfoot vocalizations Sarah had described in her research notes. Low-frequency calls carried through the trees with linguistic complexity that suggested conversation rather than instinct, while responses came from multiple directions indicating coordinated communication between different Bigfoot individuals. The vocalizations seemed to be tracking his movement, providing real-time updates to unseen Bigfoot observers who maintained perfect distance while never losing contact. When Thomas stopped moving, the Bigfoot calls stopped as well, resuming only when he continued deeper into territory that clearly belonged to these intelligent creatures. The discovery of Sarah's research equipment scattered along the trail told a story of systematic investigation rather than panicked flight. Her cameras had been carefully dismantled by what could only have been Bigfoot hands, with components arranged in patterns that suggested examination by creatures with detailed understanding of electronic devices. The memory cards were missing, but the cameras showed no signs of damage, as if the Bigfoot who had taken them apart possessed both intelligence to understand their function and manual dexterity to disassemble them without harm. Fresh Bigfoot tracks around each piece of equipment showed they were still monitoring the area. The trail led Thomas to a clearing that showed unmistakable evidence of long-term Bigfoot habitation, structures that demonstrated these creatures possessed architectural knowledge and social organization, far beyond what any researcher had previously documented. Bigfoot constructions built from natural materials demonstrated engineering principles that should have required tools, yet showed no evidence of metal components. The construction was sophisticated enough to provide shelter while remaining virtually invisible from aerial observation. Around the perimeter, Thomas found Bigfoot observation posts positioned to provide complete surveillance while remaining concealed. The structures showed signs of recent occupation: warm ashes, freshly arranged bedding materials, and lingering scent suggesting the Bigfoot inhabitants had only recently vacated in response to his approach. The thermal imaging equipment suddenly began registering massive heat signatures moving through the forest around the clearing, unmistakably the forms of multiple Bigfoot individuals. The readings showed several large Bigfoot maintaining coordinated positions in a pattern that suggested military-style surveillance, with each position providing overlapping fields of observation. The Bigfoot signatures moved with coordination that indicated communication and tactical planning that challenged every assumption about these creatures' capabilities. The most disturbing aspect was that the Bigfoot weren't hiding from his thermal equipment. They were allowing themselves to be detected as if they wanted him to understand the scope of their surveillance capabilities. The Bigfoot vocalizations suddenly changed in tone and frequency, becoming more urgent and coordinated as multiple Bigfoot voices joined what was clearly a complex conversation. The sounds carried emotional content that was unmistakably intelligent: concern, deliberation, and decision-making that suggested the Bigfoot were discussing what to do about his presence in their territory. Thomas understood that he was being evaluated by Bigfoot intelligence that possessed the cognitive ability to weigh options and make strategic decisions about threats to their community. The largest heat signature on his thermal display began moving directly toward his position, no longer maintaining distance, but approaching with obvious intent. The discovery of Sarah's final research notes in the center of the clearing revealed the true scope of what she'd uncovered about Bigfoot society. Her observations describe Bigfoot as a species that possessed not only intelligence and social organization, but cultural traditions passed down through generations of careful adaptation to human encroachment. The Bigfoot had developed sophisticated methods for avoiding detection while maintaining territorial control, creating a parallel society that existed alongside human civilization without being acknowledged. Her final notes were written in two different handwritings, her own and something else that formed crude but recognizable letters, suggesting the Bigfoot had been attempting to communicate through written language. The Bigfoot structures Thomas examined showed evidence of recent occupation, with areas used for activities he couldn't identify, but that clearly served specific purposes within Bigfoot social organization. Tool marks on wooden components indicated Bigfoot use of implements sophisticated enough to create precise joints, yet made from materials that would leave no archaeological evidence if discovered by humans. The level of craftsmanship suggested generations of accumulated knowledge refined through cultural transmission, indicating a Bigfoot civilization that had achieved technological sophistication through entirely different developmental paths than human society. Movement in his peripheral vision revealed several Bigfoot emerging from concealment around the clearing's perimeter, no longer hiding, but standing openly where he could see them. As Thomas documented his discoveries, the thermal signatures around the clearing began moving in patterns that indicated the Bigfoot were implementing some kind of response protocol. The coordination was too precise to be instinctual, suggesting they possessed established procedures for dealing with human intrusion developed through previous encounters. The movements were clearly tactical, designed to control his options while maintaining their security. Thomas realized his presence hadn't surprised the Bigfoot. They'd been expecting human investigation and had prepared accordingly. The Bigfoot surrounding him were making deliberate gestures, hand signals that seemed designed to communicate across species barriers, suggesting they had developed protocols for human contact. The electromagnetic interference suddenly intensified to levels that rendered all his electronic devices completely non-functional. His radio died mid-transmission as he attempted to report his Bigfoot discoveries to dispatch, while his GPS and emergency beacon stopped working simultaneously. The systematic failure wasn't random malfunction. It was deliberate Bigfoot interference designed to prevent him from communicating his discoveries to the outside world. The Bigfoot possessed technology or natural abilities that could disrupt human electronics without leaving trace of artificial devices. The largest Bigfoot stepped forward and gestured toward his disabled radio, then made hand movements that clearly indicated they understood the device's purpose and had deliberately neutralized it. The sounds moving through the forest became increasingly coordinated as darkness deepened, with Bigfoot vocalizations that carried the unmistakable tone of tactical communication. The Bigfoot were implementing a plan developed for situations exactly like this, with each participant understanding their role in a larger strategy designed to protect their community from exposure. The sophistication of coordination suggested command structures and communication protocols that rivaled military organizations, indicating social complexity that had evolved to deal with the constant threat of human discovery. The circle of Bigfoot around him began to contract slowly, their movements coordinated and non-threatening, but clearly designed to limit his options while maintaining complete control. Thomas felt the weight of multiple Bigfoot gazes studying his every movement as he stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by evidence of intelligence that challenged everything science claimed to understand about these creatures. The Bigfoot thermal signatures had stopped moving, creating a perfect circle around his position, while vocalizations had dropped to whispers that seemed to carry on frequencies just below human hearing. The largest Bigfoot stepped into the clearing's center, its massive form now fully visible in the moonlight that filtered through the forest canopy. The Bigfoot that approached Thomas moved with deliberate grace, each step calculated to appear non-threatening while demonstrating the creature's incredible size and obvious intelligence. Thomas counted at least 6 distinct Bigfoot figures positioned around the clearing's perimeter, each standing nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Bigfoot faces combined familiar primate features with others uniquely adapted to their environment, while their eyes held awareness that was immediately recognizable as sentient. Most unsettling was their obvious emotional complexity. Curiosity mixed with caution, intelligence tempered by ancient wisdom that suggested these Bigfoot had been observing human behavior for far longer than humans had suspected their existence. The largest Bigfoot stepped forward, its movements deliberate and non-threatening, yet carrying authority that suggested leadership within their social structure. Thomas noticed the creature's hands were remarkably human-like, with long fingers and fully opposable thumbs used to gesture in ways that seemed almost communicative. The being's eyes never left Thomas's face, studying him with intensity that suggested it was reading far more than just his physical appearance. Behind the leader, other Bigfoot maintained their positions but shifted their posture in ways that indicated they were prepared for multiple scenarios depending on how this encounter developed. The leader began making specific gestures that seemed deliberately designed to cross species communication barriers. The air around Thomas began to vibrate with subsonic frequencies he could feel more than hear, creating a sensation that seemed to resonate through his bones and into his consciousness. The Bigfoot were clearly communicating with each other through methods that transcended audible sound, using frequencies that allowed for complex information exchange without alerting potential threats. Thomas realized the Bigfoot communication system was far more sophisticated than human language, incorporating emotional and sensory data that created a complete picture of the situation for all participants. All the Bigfoot around the clearing responded simultaneously to some unheard signal, their movements coordinated with precision that indicated they were sharing detailed information about his condition, intentions, and potential threat level. The Bigfoot leader began making gestures that seemed deliberately slow and exaggerated, as if attempting to communicate across species barriers through universal body language. Thomas found himself responding instinctively to the creature's movements, understanding on some primal level that he was being invited to participate in a form of communication that predated human speech. The exchange that followed challenged everything he thought he knew about intelligence and consciousness, as the Bigfoot being demonstrated cognitive abilities that suggested not just awareness, but wisdom accumulated through lifetimes of careful observation and learning. The answers seemed to flow through the creature's gestures, an understanding of human behavior that was both compassionate and calculating. The other Bigfoot began moving closer, their approach coordinated but non-threatening, creating a circle around Thomas that felt more protective than confining. Each creature was clearly an individual with distinct facial features and body language that suggested different personalities and roles within their group structure. Thomas noticed the Bigfoot were examining his equipment with obvious curiosity, their expressions indicating they understood the purpose of his devices, even though Bigfoot technology operated on entirely different principles. The sophistication of their interest suggested they had been studying human technological development for decades, possibly centuries. Their careful examination of his gear suggested they understood not just what his equipment did, but what it represented about human capabilities and limitations. As the encounter continued, Thomas began to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented in human history. First contact with Bigfoot, a species that had been deliberately avoiding detection while maintaining careful observation of human civilization. The Bigfoot behavior suggested they had been waiting for the right moment, the right individual, to reveal themselves under controlled circumstances. The Bigfoot choice of Thomas wasn't random. They had been studying him, evaluating his character and capabilities through methods he couldn't comprehend. Their calm, measured approach suggested they had determined that he possessed the psychological stability and moral character necessary to process this encounter without becoming a threat to their community. The Bigfoot leader extended one massive hand toward Thomas, palm open in a gesture that was unmistakably peaceful despite the creature's intimidating size. Thomas found himself reaching out in response, his training and instincts overridden by a deeper understanding that this moment would define not just his own fate, but potentially the future relationship between humans and Bigfoot. The contact that followed sent sensations through his consciousness that defied description, images, emotions, and knowledge that seemed to flow directly from the creature's mind into his own. The mental connection revealed glimpses of Bigfoot society that challenged every assumption about intelligence, consciousness, and the relationship between species. A civilization that had achieved harmony with their environment while maintaining technological sophistication that operated on principles entirely different from human science. Thomas's final radio transmission, partially captured by automated recording equipment at the ranger station, contained fragments that would later puzzle investigators who tried to piece together his final moments. His voice carried a mixture of awe and terror as he described encountering Bigfoot, beings that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. But the transmission cut off before he could provide specific details. The recording equipment registered Bigfoot vocalizations in the background that didn't match any cataloged wildlife sounds, while electromagnetic readings showed interference patterns that suggested the presence of Bigfoot technology that operated on principles unknown to human science. The final words captured were barely audible. "The Bigfoot aren't what we thought they were." The search for Thomas Mitchell began at dawn the following day, but the teams found only his abandoned equipment arranged in patterns that suggested it had been examined by Bigfoot intelligence and deliberately placed rather than dropped in panic or struggle. His radio was positioned to provide maximum signal transmission, while his emergency supplies were organized with obvious intelligence, indicating that the Bigfoot who had encountered him possessed detailed understanding of human survival equipment and its purposes. Most disturbing was the complete absence of any signs of struggle or violence. Thomas had simply vanished, leaving behind only evidence that he'd encountered Bigfoot beings that possessed both the intelligence to understand his equipment and the capability to make him disappear without a trace. The thermal imaging footage recovered from Thomas's equipment told a story that investigators couldn't officially acknowledge but couldn't ignore. The recordings showed Bigfoot heat signatures that moved with obvious intelligence and coordination, beings that understood they were being observed and had developed countermeasures to avoid detailed documentation. The footage captured moments of what appeared to be deliberate communication between the Bigfoot and Thomas, interactions that suggested these creatures possessed language capabilities and were attempting to convey information that he was struggling to understand. The final frame showed Thomas moving voluntarily toward the largest Bigfoot heat signature, suggesting that whatever happened to him occurred with his cooperation rather than through force. The investigation team discovered additional evidence that raised more questions than it answered about Thomas's Bigfoot encounter. Thomas's personal journal, found in his vehicle, contained entries from the weeks leading up to his disappearance that suggested he had been experiencing unusual dreams and sensations that seemed to be drawing him toward specific areas where Bigfoot activity had been reported. His sketches from those final weeks showed anatomical details of Bigfoot creatures that matched no known species, yet were drawn with accuracy that suggested he had observed them directly. The progression of his entries indicated a growing awareness that Bigfoot were attempting to communicate with him through methods that bypassed conscious thought. The official investigation concluded that Thomas Mitchell had become disoriented in difficult terrain and succumbed to exposure, a finding that satisfied administrative requirements while avoiding questions about Bigfoot that couldn't be answered through conventional means. But the evidence secured by investigators told a different story entirely. One of contact between human and Bigfoot intelligence that had resulted in Thomas's disappearance under circumstances that challenged fundamental assumptions about what lived in the wilderness areas humans thought they controlled. The case files remained classified, accessible only to personnel with clearance levels that ensured the truth about Bigfoot would never reach public awareness. The area where Thomas Mitchell encountered Bigfoot was quietly designated as environmentally sensitive habitat, officially closed to public access due to concerns about disrupting wildlife breeding patterns. But locals reported that the restricted zone remained active long after the official investigation concluded. Bigfoot sounds carrying through the forest on windless nights that resembled conversation more than animal calls, electromagnetic interference that affected electronic devices for miles around the closure area, and a persistent sense that Bigfoot were watching from the tree line whenever anyone approached the restricted boundaries. The forest had reclaimed its secrets, but the evidence suggested that those secrets were actively maintained by Bigfoot intelligence that understood the importance of remaining hidden from a world that wasn't ready to accept their existence. On quiet nights, when the wind carries sounds from the deep forest, other rangers sometimes wonder if Thomas Mitchell found the Bigfoot he was looking for, or if the Bigfoot found something in him that made them decide he was worthy of their trust. The thermal readings from that final night continue to puzzle experts who study them in classified facilities, while the electromagnetic signatures recorded during his Bigfoot encounter remain unexplained by conventional science. Perhaps Thomas Mitchell didn't vanish at all. Perhaps he simply crossed a threshold into a Bigfoot world that had been waiting patiently for someone ready to understand that humanity was never alone in the wilderness it claimed to know. Years later, hikers in remote areas of Olympic National Forest occasionally report Bigfoot encounters that echo Thomas Mitchell's final transmission. Glimpses of massive figures moving through the trees with obvious intelligence, electromagnetic interference that renders modern technology useless, and the persistent sensation of being observed by Bigfoot that understand human behavior better than humans understand themselves. The forest keeps its Bigfoot secrets, but sometimes those secrets choose to reveal themselves to individuals who demonstrate the wisdom to understand that some knowledge about Bigfoot comes with responsibilities that extend far beyond personal curiosity. Thomas Mitchell may have discovered that the greatest mystery isn't what Bigfoot live in the wilderness, but what the Bigfoot have learned about us.